Something we keep covering lately. It's the concept of a first game, which isn't the first game someone makes, contrarily enough. It's more like a game that a team is making that they're not really familiar with the hardware, maybe, or maybe they've never made this genre before, or maybe they're just trying something different. It's their first game. And so they're trying out stuff, and they're getting used to the hardware, and they're getting used to the concepts and the genre, and all that other fun stuff. It's a very common concept. It makes a lot of sense. It's why first games tend to suck. Speaking of which, Suikoden 1. No, okay, I'm not here to say Suikoden 1 sucks. Although, something I've been thinking about doing, and I am curious of any feedback on this, one of the ways that has been suggested to add a little bit of additional context to these, the post-stream wrap-up videos we do, is to actually share the stats, kind of like maybe in a graphic on the bottom or something. Which I could do crudely, very easily, but I'd want to put together some kind of actual graphic there, just have some absolutely microscopic amount of presentation values or something. So if you have any interest in that, just let me know. I'm curious. Anywho, so this game scored a little bit better than I expected it to, if I'm being completely honest. The game itself was inoffensive and kind of relaxing to play through. There were some very serious game design problems, and it's very obvious that it was a first game, but you could see a lot of what would eventually become the potential of the Suikoden series here. It makes even more sense because they made this game to make Suikoden 2. Okay, hold on, before you jump on me. Let's talk about that. So, I mentioned as an aside at the very beginning of my stream of Suikoden 1 that Suikoden 1 was made to make Suikoden 2. The only reason I even mentioned that was because it amused me. Because what we have done here on this show is we've reviewed a lot of games to get to the point where we could review properly. A lot of the games that are now archived and no longer valid reviews were being done so we could learn the process. And so it was amusing to me that one of the games in the old archives, a review that's no longer valid, Suikoden 2, was done so we could do a proper review of Suikoden 1. That was it. That was the whole point of that. I just thought that little symmetry and irony was amusing. But I had someone pop up and say that Mike over in Resident Arc actually had debunked that. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So I decided to do a little bit of digging of my own into interviews and whatnot. I found out a couple interesting facts, especially the fact that Murayama in particular has a lot of interviews within the last few years and not a lot before that. In fact, a huge amount of the behind-the-scenes information I was able to find was stuff that's recently come out. Probably because of the fact that, Eiyuden Chronicles, however you pronounce that, was announced and is something that they're in development on, super hype and all that. But I'm pretty sure that's part of why that resurgence of interest and interviewing has happened. So I couldn't find anything confirming or denying the aforementioned statement. I was confused about that. So I decided to go and just pull up the in-question video by Resident Arc. And apparently Mike had just reached out to the dude personally. I wish I could do that. I wish I had the kind of pull to be able to reach out to developers and be like, hey, why? Why this? But anyways, if you ever wondered why Resident Arc is a wildly successful, amazing channel, and I'm over here in my tiny little corner of the internet, stuff like that is why. So, that was cool. That's the answer. Murayama flat out said, I did not write Suikoden 1 to write Suikoden 2. I wrote Suikoden 1 as its own thing, and then later was attached to Suikoden 2. Okay, so that settles the matter, right? No, because that's not what I said, and it actually isn't even related to what I said, only partially. Here's the thing. What I said, and I'll say this again, just to make this very clear, is that Suikoden 1 was made by the development team, who had no idea what they were doing, in order to make Suikoden 2. Now, you could argue that left, right, upways, or sideways, but let me toss out a few factoids for you. I discovered an interesting bit of behind-the-scenes stuff. I'm not going to run you through all of it. Like I said, there's a whole lot of interviews. I highly recommend there's this one really big interview in Level magazine. Some of you may know what that is, but for those of you who don't, it's a Swedish magazine which has some really cool behind-the-scenes info. And again, nice big interview. But the couple of things I want to point out to you. First of all, Konami really wanted to jump on the PlayStation very early. Now, we have other sources confirming this. A lot of what they did with like the Castlevania series, for example, or a couple of other franchises. Konami leapt onto the PlayStation because they thought it was going to score big, and they were right. That makes perfect sense. Anybody with a grain of sense at that point in history could tell you that the PlayStation was going to hit it big. Why? Because it was the next big Nintendo console. No, I'm dead serious, because the Nintendo PlayStation was what it was supposed to be, and it was mostly designed and built with that in mind, which means that it had all of the hallmarks of quality and progression that was effectively expected at the time of Nintendo, and they kind of dominated the market for a reason. So just about anybody could look at the Sony PlayStation, there's other factors as well, and say, yeah, that's probably going to explode. So credit to Konami for walking on that. That's not something you can hear me say very often. Credit to Konami. So they jumped on it. How far did they jump on it? This game came out just about a year after the PlayStation was released. Very early PlayStation 1 game. So that's point number one. Point number two, obviously this game was very crunched, as most games were back in the day, and unfortunately still are. There was a lot of sleeping in the office and just cramming through it in order to push through it. There's this horrific story about a bug that came through, which they had to go push out and then print the CDs and all sorts of other stuff. Again, I'm not going to bore you with all the interview stuff. You can go read it if you want the full details. But they jumped onto it early. They specifically wanted to beat both Square and Enix, who, as a reminder, were separate companies at the time, to the PlayStation. But also, which they did. FF7 wouldn't come out for like another year and a half after this. But the other thing is, one of the mandates was that they demanded that the game that they end up making be the first game in a series. Konami always walked into Suikoden with the intent that there would be a Suikoden 2. Also, several of the people who were working on this game had either never made an RPG before, or had never made a video game before. This is where my original statement kind of comes back into context. Now, I don't have 100% proof of this, but I would be willing to say with high certainty that knowing that a 2 was going to be made, and knowing that the way Konami was pushing this back in the day, throwing a lot of weight into it, as I've talked about before when it comes to game development, it's very likely that a lot of the people making this game were learning how to make not only video games, but this particular game, the JRPG, the Suikoden series, whatever you want to call that, as they went, and then could then apply those practices and ideas over in Suikoden 2. Now, that being said, Moriyama completely detached from that. As he himself said in that interview, he just wrote Suikoden 1 and then was brought in to write Suikoden 2. Completely distinct things. Now, that's also important to keep in mind, because that means all of the bits of foreshadowing in 1 to 2, like they flat out mentioned the Joustin City-State, there's the stuff with Uber, there's the lead-up and build-up with Flick and Victor, etc. All of that was probably backloaded storytelling, aka they looked back at it and adapted to it, as opposed to front-loaded storytelling, aka we had a plan in mind and we're already making it. Although even that doesn't, I'm not 100% sure I believe that, but the only way to disbelieve that is to literally disagree with something that he said flat out in a one-to-one interview when asked point-blank the question. So, analysis and statements are starting to disagree with each other, so let's just move on. Because the relevance here is Suikoden 1 is Suikoden 2's alpha. No matter how we want to think of that or look at that, it is the first game, as I just mentioned, as I started this whole thing with. It is the Zelda 1 to Zelda LTTP. Yes, I know what I said. So, how does it actually hold up gameplay-wise? Could be worse. It could be worse. I'm actually surprised at how many elements of good there were here. The level scaling system, the reasonable spread of quality with regards to party members, the optional super party members, the let go system, which is just a great hallmark of the franchise. The punchiness and speed of going into, through, and out of combat. There's no seconds and minutes problems here. It's just and you're in and out. Most of the bosses are inoffensive. The dungeons suck. The lack of information in the game is real. The interface is cumbersome at best. Just doing something as simple as sorting your inventory and your party when you get back to town is this huge hassle because you have to talk to 3 separate NPCs and go through multiple menus to try to do anything. The game has the wonderful teleport system where you can teleport to any place you've been to before from town, and you can use an item to teleport back to town. So you have, it's a little bit more steps than it should be, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a fast travel system. This, in addition to the fact that you have an item that can exit you from most dungeons, means you can get around pretty quickly, and that saves a lot of backtracking, which is good, because how many of you knew that you could actually permanently destroy the mirror in Suikoden 1? I didn't know that. If you do, there's a lot of backtracking, like bad backtracking in this game. Like, go here, let me walk you through this. There's this one section in Chapter 3 where you go to the town and you talk to the person, then you walk back, go into an area, leave an area, walk up here, encounters the whole way. Go into the town, go to the end of town, go into the boat, take the boat to your castle, go to the castle, go up top, talk to him, go back down to the bottom of your castle, go back into the boat, take the boat back over to town, go through the town, go down through this area, encounters the whole way, another area, encounters, and then get back to the spot where you're at. It's bad. Unless you have the mirror, in which case you go up here, you go back there, and you're done. So don't get rid of the mirror. But the mirror was a good idea. The encounter rate isn't great, but it's bypassable. Again, the let go system is fantastic. I like the idea of the runes. They're very powerful spells, but they have very limited ammo, so it's basically rockets at that point, and to use a similar parlance. I enjoy a lot of the sprite work. The actual characters have some really good sprite work, and they look pretty cool. The brickwork looks terrible. Actively bad to the point where it detracts not only from the narrative, but from actually telling what you're looking at, and in several cases just makes the game worse. There was one point where I actually pulled up a screenshot of another game, which I shall not mention right now, and I was just like, here, look at this room, and now look at this room. And the game in Suikoden 1, the room was a completely empty room. It was just a one-tile floor with a one-tile wall, and a staircase, and another staircase, and that's it. That's it. And I pointed that out because that's one of the reasons why I get so on about doodads as design, as something that's so relevant and important to game design. It does so much to make the game feel better. It's kind of a form of uncanny valley. It's similar to the animation problem, which this game also has, by the way, where most of the game is static and very few things are actually animated. It's when your eyes unconsciously notice something off about what you're looking at, hence the uncanny valley concept. It just looks weird. You don't really, or at least you shouldn't, really notice it if everything's fine, if there's good doodad design, if there's good animation usage, if the person looks like an actual person or doesn't look like an actual person. It doesn't bother you, it doesn't even occur to you. But if it's off, and again, that's why I'm on those kind of things so much. The dungeon designs, I already mentioned this, are terrible. The final dungeon of the game is literally a series of corridors where you fight the same enemies over and over, like a lot of them. The final boss is just 30,000 HP, and the fact that they can heal an AoE constantly, like that's it. Boss design, not great. A lot of options for you. There's a lot of ways you can build your party. You have however many playable characters, I don't even know. It's a lot. And pretty much all of them are viable to some extent or another. It's a very much choose your favorites, pick your favorites kind of a thing. And with the level up thing, the fact that you can level up so quickly, the catch-up mechanic I mentioned, I should explain that, sorry. The way it works is you gain more, so enemies have a level. You have a level. If you're under their level, you get a lot more experience than you others would. And you get more experience the lower you are, and less experience the higher you are. And you get the same experience you're supposed to get if you were at the level of the enemy. So your leveling zooms up and then slows down and then slows down and slows down and slows down. So not only is it anti-grindy because at a certain point enemies start giving you like 5 experience, but it's anti-grindy because it takes very little time to catch up. So if you bring a brand new character you don't even like, they will be caught up within a few battles. This also means even if you're not bringing a brand new character, but you're just bringing your favorites to an area, every new zone, you only really need to do the first handful of encounters within the area because those will give you a nice big chunk of experience, and then less, and then less. I actually showed this off on camera. There was one dungeon I went into where I think it took 2 rooms of encounters before I could just start letting go, which is allowed based on your level versus their level, and effectively skip encounters for the rest of the dungeon if I wanted to. That's awesome. That's great design. It's a shame that so much of the rest of the game is all over the place. I'm trying to convey here. I hope I'm getting across at least a little bit of how insane this game really is to analyze from a gameplay perspective, because the gameplay is simultaneously excellent and terrible, just depending, right? And there's a whole lot of just, hey, oh, ah, throughout the whole thing. I will say, as a quick aside, I think personally the Necklord, excuse me, I always do that, Necklord, there's no the there, is probably the best boss in the entire game, probably one of the better designed ones. And even helped by his dungeon being at least interesting on the way up to him. By contrast, having to go back down through the dungeon, Turbo sucks. And that just brings us back to how this game is both good and bad at the same time. I could go into more details, but honestly, that's what the review's for. So you're here to hear me talk about the lore, right? Wrong. You're here to hear me talk about both. Lore, runner, story, gameplay. That's the whole idea. But okay, fine. I'll talk a little bit about the lore, because there's not much. There's not much to talk about. One of the other hallmarks of a first game is it tends to be simple. Now, let's get this out of the way, because this is something I see a lot of people say. Simple does not mean bad. It means simple. It means less. Ironically, designing something that is simple and good is arguably harder than designing something that is complex and good, because complexity allows you additional layers and support structure to make other gameplay aspects and story aspects work better. Because if you have a big supporting cast and all of them are awesome, but your plot is kind of weak or whatever, but you got this going on at the same time, and there's also this side paralogue thing going on, you have more pillars for the story to sit on. More complexity means more options for good or bad, right? By contrast, if it's simple, you get the one or two shots. Is it good or not? Yes or no. So let's get the bad out of the way first. Oh yeah, spoiler warning in 3. So the localization is bad. I've seen worse. In fact, I have seen worse in the PlayStation era by better companies. FF7 is an example of one I've pointed to many times that has a localization that most people don't even properly understand how terrible it is, because it gets to the point where the dialogue is literally not English anymore. But the localization in this game is not great. All you have to do is ask our chief surgeon, or occasionally our chief medical officer, what he thinks of that. Regardless, the localization is at least passable, but there are several scenes where you actually have trouble figuring out what's going on because it is that terrible. My personal favorite example is there's this one bit when you're coming back from the dwarf village, I believe, and the fire, the great glass of fire death has been fired, and there's literally a director's note that got translated in as dialogue. Rushed development, and crunched development, and didn't know what we were doing development, like I said. But the weird thing to me is the narrative of this game has so little to talk about that I actually thought about just calling this a wash and not discussing the lore of this game at all. And I mean that. Not as a derogatory, just because it's a fairly basic story. It's very heavily inspired by the original 108 story of China Wash. I forget the name of it right now. The thing that is called Suikoden over there. Funny story, actually. According to one of the interviews I was reading, Moriyama was trying to explain the concept of the game and how it was inspired by that novel. And in order to try and get that across to the executive he was talking to, he explained it as a Suikoden story. And the person said, "Great! There you go. We'll call it Suikoden." And here we are. I was trying to parallel this. It'd be like if someone was like, "I want to make a story like Jurassic Park." And someone's like, "Aha! Perfect. We'll call it Jurassic Park." That's not a one-to-one thing, but it is kind of close to how this lined up. But anyways, we've got the 108, we've got the stars, we've got destiny, whether or not fate is relevant or not. There's some good character moments which are ruined by some bad presentation. I don't have much to share about most of the story. Like I said, it's there and it's serviceable. It has a strong intro. It establishes a lot very quickly and efficiently. But then you're going about trying to lead a rebellion against an evil empire. Now, it does have some shadings of what I personally consider to be what would eventually be the Suikoden hallmarks. There's some nuance going on here. Not every Imperial is evil, and there's a lot of people you recruit that are, well, not cool. They're just willing to throw in against the local organization because it suits them or it benefits them. There's also some really horrific things that some of the Imperial soldiers do, but they were being mind-controlled, so that's okay. But then there's the other ones who are not being mind-controlled, and that's actually kind of relevant. After all, Commander Craze and his wonderful desire to be seen as the great leader that he is someone who's just an asshole who probably deserved to die. As a quick curiosity question, how many of you have Craze executed? Because I do. There's no detriment. You don't lose out on any of the 108 for having him executed. You do for all the others, like all the other people you can choose to, but you can just let him die. But then there's your dad, who you don't have an option to spare. Now, one of my viewers, the amazing Savacom, asked me, "Hey, Lore, what's the theme of this game?" Now, my knee-jerk reaction was, there wasn't one. There is no theme for this game. But I started thinking about it a little bit while I was Kirbying my lunch in order to get ready for this video. And I realized that there is a theme that came to the surface as I was playing through it, as I was processing the whole game here. People are idiots. That probably sounds like a joke. I don't mean it as one. I legitimately think that is the core theme of the game. That people, for their own reasons, will do willingly and knowingly do very stupid things for very stupid reasons. Think about how many of the Imperial soldiers are loyal to a fault, and it has to be pointed out to them how dumb that is, and how much they are actually betraying their oaths by doing so. Once pointed out to them, once it's considered acceptable because an external source has validated the thought that they themselves have been hesitant to speak of, okay, they're willing to kind of sway on that one. How many times do we see someone who is willing to go along with something because they didn't want to speak up? Or maybe because they didn't detect that there was this horrific poison in the tea. Or maybe they were totally cool with oppressing the local populace who were having money ripped out of them, almost literally right out of their hides, and we're just going along with it because, I say idiots, but there's a little bit of a not my problem thing going along here, but there's another layer to this, and it's the layer of loyalty. I know what you're thinking. Loyalty isn't stupid. So, most concepts taken to an extreme tend to be stupid, in my opinion. Loyalty is no exception to that. One of the counter-arguments I've actually heard before is, Laura, you just don't understand. If your sister, wanted to do this evil thing, you'd totally go along with it because it's your sister. To which I say, no, I wouldn't. That's stupid. She's trying to do this horribly evil thing. I'm not loyal to her, the end. I'm loyal to her because of who she is. If that changes, whether because of alien possession or because, to use the Barbarossa example, because she hasn't been laid lately, then all of a sudden that loyalty, it's gone. But that's the way I work. And historically, a lot of people don't really follow that kind of thing. I actually have a theory about that. Just a theory. That a lot of people, historically speaking, have pinned their identity to something like that. They're pinned their identity to the crown or a specific leader or a nation or a flag or an ideal, and that's who they are. So they have to stick with that. Otherwise, they'd have to question who they are, or they'd have to question if they were right about who they were, or they'd have to consider changing who they are. But instead, they adhere to that, right? And so we have our father, Tio, who is loyal to a fault to a flailing and corrupt emperor who is leading a flailing and corrupt empire, who is so loyal that he actually is willing to die while attempting to murder his own son. Even as he dies, it's so clear. I just want to smack him. You could join us, dude. You are wasting your life. But he has to maintain that loyalty, either because he's stupid, or because it's part of his identity, or because he refuses to change. There's a little bit of the old days kind of going on in this game as well. It's kind of a background element, but there's a lot of people who talk about, the 7 years ago. That was the Great War. That was when things were awesome. And there's a little bit of that vibe going on too. And so I look at a lot of these characters, and I just want to smack them. The worst is, biggest spoiler of all, although I've already given it away, Barbarossa himself, who has this whole speech to Wendy, a despicably evil woman, about how he truly loved her, which I'm not going to talk about that, and wanted to reform her, change her, and clearly that's why he pretended to be mind-controlled, and let his empire turn into this corrupt, decadent, bureaucratic nonsense mess, which we see a decent amount of in the intro. Like I said, good intro, strong intro. All for his love of a woman. Love of a woman. I made fun of him constantly throughout the entire run. And I stand by that, because he's a moron. Doesn't make him badly written. He's just an idiot. And that, like I said, I think is the primary theme of this work, that people will do very stupid things for very stupid reasons. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on this one. Next up, we're going to be playing Romance of the Three Kingdoms 14, which I'm mentioning that only because of how amusing it is that we're playing that right after Suikoden. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.